Hi everyone, good morning, good evening, good afternoon, wherever you're joining me from today. My name's Heidi Hasting, and today we're going to be talking about sensitivity labels at the Data Platform Virtual Summit. I'm going to show you what they look like across the data platform. So first, a little bit about me. As I said, my name's Heidi Hasting. I was originally a software developer, but I've transitioned into a business intelligence professional. I'm a huge fan of application lifecycle management, database lifecycle management, and Azure DevOps. I'm a regular attendee at tech events, both in person and virtual, all over the world. I work for a company called Expose here in Australia as one of their senior consultants, and you can reach me on Twitter at Heidi Hasting or check my blog out at heidihasting.com. Feel free to drop me a line if you have any questions throughout today's session. This is a pre-recorded session, so I'm not presenting this live, but I will be available in the chat to answer any questions while you're watching the recording. And join me at the end for some Q&A time. So sensitivity labels is something I saw a couple of years ago at another presentation on Office 365. So I saw it then about how it works within Office and things like data loss protection. And I wanted to know how it looks in the data platform now that it's starting to appear more and more in the data estate. So when I say data estate, I'm thinking things like Azure SQL, like Power BI, like Azure Purview. So in this session, I'm going to talk about what sensitivity labels are. I'm going to show you a bit of the prerequisites and the setup to having sensitivity labels in your tenant, and then what they look like through the different products, or what they don't look like, as the case may be. We're also going to look at how we can then see them in terms of a reporting monitoring perspective. So let's get straight into it. Sensitivity labels are just that, they're a label. They're something that you can use to classify data assets. So if you think about it in terms of information management, you might label Word documents already or emails. You might say this is a confidential document, this is a public document, or this is commercial sensitive. Those sorts of classifications are often termed labels. And in the case of the Microsoft stack, we can use a concept called sensitivity labels to apply that classification information. It's another element of metadata that we can use to provide information about the data assets itself, both to our administrators, to our developers, to our end users. It can be applied to various things, so you can apply it to things like Office products like Word, Excel, PowerPoint. You can also apply it to things like SharePoint and email, and then in the data estate, things like Power BI reports and Azure SQL columns. So you can use it to provide additional information and additional security. The additional security is only in certain concepts and caveats. So I will point a few of those gotchas out. If you're thinking that sensitivity labels is going to be the be all and end all for security, it's not. It's more of a label that's going to guide users on how to treat that data asset, not necessarily completely block them from accessing it or from sharing it. Licensing is a really important thing to consider when you are looking at the features, these sorts of features. So it is an Office 365 functionality. So when you're looking at license, you want to look at the E5 license within Office 365, or previously it would have been things like the Azure Information Protection Plans, P1 and P2. And that's just to get the sensitivity label functionality within your tenant, because it starts in the Office 365 space. After that, when you are looking at it in the data estate, specifically products like Power BI do require you to have specific licensing in order to use sensitivity labels on the Power BI reports. So that's things like Power BI Pro and Premium per user. So throughout the screenshots later in the session, I will be using an E5 license, and I should point out it's a single license on the tenant. So once a single E5 license is enabled, then you can access the sensitivity label functionality. And then I've also used a Power BI Pro and a Premium per user test account. Microsoft have put together some really great process flows when it comes to sensitivity labels. It's a simple three-step process. So the first thing we need to look at is the administration side. In order to work with sensitivity labels, we obviously need to create the label, but creating a label on its own just makes it appear on the tenant. It doesn't make it available to users to use. In order to make it available for use, we also have to publish that sensitivity label, and the publishing process is referred to as creating a policy. So you have both a label and a policy, and that's the administration side, is creating those and defining who has access to them and what they mean in specific functionality cases. Once we have them set up, we then transition into how our users are going to use the label to attach it to a data asset, but also how they're going to view those labels on existing data assets or once they've been added. And then lastly, but not least, that we're working on the Office 365, Office or third-party products. So what that means is there is the ability to apply additional security when it comes to Office and third-party products. So think about things like Excel. If a data set is stored in Excel and that data set has a particular classification applied to it in the Excel file, if that was to be distributed to someone who doesn't have access to that sensitivity label, it does have an element of security there, whereas Power BI does not, because it's controlled by the Power BI Service Workspace access. So let's go through and do some setup and management. So I'm going to show you how to create a label, and I'm going to show you what that looks like. And the main reason I wanted to do that is not all the time is the person in a data role also someone that's in an Office 365 role. Some companies separate out the administration and maintenance of Office 365 with Azure, with data assets or things like Power Platform, Power BI. So when you look at sensitivity labels, you'll want to know what it looks like in the Office 365 Admin Center, because that is the starting point and that's the setup and management. And even if you're not in a role that is the person creating the sensitivity label or maintaining them, having that awareness of how they are created and maintained will help with the conversations within your org. It'll also give you some pointers around what are the conversations, what are the questions we need to ask, what's the granularity we need to look for, how is that going to be handled, what are our options. So when you are looking to do sensitivity labels, the first thing you'll go to the Microsoft 365 Admin Center. If you've never seen the Admin Center before, this is the basic home screen that you'll enter when you first access the Admin Center. From there, you're going to go into Show All to be able to see all the admin centers, and then go into Compliance. So previously, this would have been a different menu, but more recently, it is now Admin Center Compliance. It will load the Microsoft Purview screens. Before that would have been Microsoft 365 Admin Center. Within Purview, on the left-hand side, there is the option for information protection. And one thing I'll point out, if you are having a bit of a look through the Purview screens, you will notice in other areas, such as data loss prevention, it refers to labels. That is different to the information protection sensitivity labels. So if you're looking at sensitivity labels, go to information protection. The first time you load this screen, once you do have sensitivity label functionality, i.e. you have a license, you will then see that there are no labels. There are no labels set up in the tenant. So there's no labels there to start with. You'll go in and create a label and then go through the various steps. So if you do have a blank section here, and you have sensitivity labels enabled, don't be surprised if later on down the track you don't see any labels in any of the client products. That would let you set the labeling. So when we create a label, we get options to define the name and description. We also get options around the scope, and the scope here, it's really important to understand the scope is not just your data estate. So it's not just your Power BI or your Azure SQL or your Azure Purview. It's a combination of those and also Office 365. So think SharePoint, Files, OneDrive. You can protect files both through an encryption aspect and also from a watermark. So the encrypt here is more whether it's going to have offline access or online. So if you think about that in the context of someone gets a file, say they get an Excel file out of OneDrive, or they get a Power BI export to Excel file, that can then have the ability to check back to the Office 365 labeling to determine does your account have access to that label or not in an offline state. So you can go offline over a period of time. So you have the files locally on your laptop, you're offline for a couple of days, then it comes back online to check that you have access. We'll talk about that more in the coming screens. And lastly, we wanted to publish. And as I said earlier, publishing requires the creation of a policy. And when we create a policy, we also get a number of options around what labels do we want to publish, who has access to those labels, both from a user and groups and a combination of, so users or groups or users and groups. Policy settings, mandatory requirements. Mandatory requirements is something that's really cool because you can start enforcing a policy around labels must be applied to certain things such as Power BI reports. And additional information, which might mean a internal URL for a website that has information about your information protection guidelines and your sensitivity labeling categories, and then what those mean and how they can be used, as well as potentially additional training materials and guidance. So you have the option of supplying additional information URL. I'm going to now walk you through the screens on creating a label. So back in the Microsoft Purview portal, we would have said create a label. And then from there, we specify the name and display name. And a cool little thing to note is we can just define two different descriptions, one for our end users, but then also one for our administrators. So that might be handy to indicate who is the custodian of a particular label. So if it's your cybersecurity team or your finance team or your workforce team, that might come in handy to be able to supply that additional information back to your admins. Or it might be where you put a reference to a ticketing system to indicate how that particular label came about, what the request was. If we look, here is an example of that screen filled in. So you can see I've supplied the name and display name and some additional description information. We then define the scope for the label. So these are your options when it comes to scope. So it's not clearly pointed out there what you do when you're looking at data estate in terms of Power BI, but it is when it comes to schematized data sets down the bottom. So even though this is unchecked in the screenshot, the examples later on will be using an environment that has it checked. So you can define the scope of a label. So you may want to separate your labeling based on data estate versus non-data estate, or you may want to have conversations across your org and go, hey, sensitivity labels is a functionality that goes across both data, information, and a number of other areas. How do we want to coexist on the tenancy to share the sensitivity label functionality? So if you are looking at it only from a data estate perspective, be prepared to have conversations in your org about how it would be used in the Office 365 space as well, so that you take into account those considerations. We can define the encryption and watermarking available. Within encryption, we get the option to control the access to a file that has that label applied. So as you'll see here, we've got it as user access to the content never expires and it's always available offline. So that means if someone was to get an Excel file, save it on their computer, it's not going to check back all the time to see do they still have access to that label. So that's something to be aware of in terms of your data stewardship and controlling access to data is, do you want to allow offline access to something that has this label at all? Because if someone leaves your organization and they happen to have the file, they could probably still open it. We look at assigning permissions, so we can do users groups or a combination thereof, and what permissions they're going to allow. And then this is just an example of what the encryption options are if you did want to have it set to offline access for a specific period of time. So here we would specify it's in the number of days, and then we specify how many days. I want to show you the watermark here. This is important to note that the watermark doesn't apply to a lot of the data estate. It mainly only applies to like Word and email. So you want to look at this in terms of style guides and in terms of not you leveraging this thinking it's going to appear on all your Power BI reports as a watermark with the labeling information, because it won't. And then things like font color, that's a restrictive list. So it's not like a full RGB color picker. It is only about a list of, I think, 5 or 6 colors. So it's not a long list. Be aware in your style guide for considerations there. Auto labeling, I'm not going to go into auto labeling, but it's important to note that there is the ability to do auto labeling. This is predominantly in files and emails, but there is the concept later down the road with Purview. And then we can define the protection settings when it comes to SharePoint and groups. Or we can auto label when it comes to things like Purview, applying labels across Azure SQL and other options such as Synapse, Cosmos, etc. Again, I'm not going to go into auto labeling because it's quite an in-depth topic, but I will provide some links at the end of the session if you want to dive in deeply on that session topic. So lastly, we get the ability to review all the settings we've set, and then we can go ahead and create the label. Once the label has been created, we get an a direct screen to go to the publishing of the label, because that's the next step we want to do, is publish the label and apply a policy. So now we've created a label, but if we were to leave the admin portal at this point in time, we would just have a label sitting on the tenant, not necessarily something that can be used by our users. So we're going to publish the label. So these are the publish screens. So you'll notice here we're in the create a policy. So I've navigated directly from the end of creating the label straight into the creating a policy. If you did need to create a new policy within the Microsoft Purview portal under the information protection, instead of selecting labels, if you pick label policies, you would then be able to create a policy from that area of the portal as well. So first we pick the sensitivity labels that we're going to publish. So here I've picked confidential. And then we go in and pick which users will have access to this label. So again, users, groups, or a combination thereof. So these sorts of things are important to know, as it might change the way you structure your groups and users. If you're already looking at it in terms of how you're giving access to your reporting or your other data assets within your estate, then it might be something you've already considered. But if not, you may want to change your group structures to support sensitivity labels associated with groups. Those groups might be roles, so it might be your finance area, your HR area, your IT area. It might be, contractors, external people. These are things you want to consider as you're going through. We can define settings around the policy. Now, none of these are ticked, but I did want to show you a screenshot so you can see what they are. Three of them are, actually all of them are really important, let's be honest. The first one's really cool. So think about sensitivity labels. Only one label gets applied to any data asset, except when you're going into column level stuff in Azure SQL and the like. But if you think about applying a label, let's say you applied a confidential label to a Power BI report, and someone goes in and changes that confidential label down to public. Well, public is more broad access throughout the organization and potentially external to your org. So you might want the ability to enforce a standard so that if someone does change the sensitivity label to another label, that they have to provide a reason for that. So this option, when you're creating a policy, does just that. It enforces the requirement that if someone changes a sensitivity label to a lower classification, that there is justification provided. And those justifications are recorded in the activity logs. So you then, thinking about that from an auditing and monitoring perspective, you can go audit your activity logs for changes in the sensitivity labeling and start looking at, is the granularity we've defined our labels too broad or too small? Or is it the case of it's unclear what labeling to apply, or people have left all the labeling as the default? The other option is requiring users to apply a label to all Power BI content. So if you're considering using sensitivity labels as a feature of functionality to help with your information management and governance of data, then you may want to enforce that Power BI content has to have a label applied, so that your users are enforced on placing a label on all reports they publish, or all data flows they create, or all data mats they spin up. Another one is that providing a user with a link. And it's good to know that you can provide an additional URL for a particular group of sensitivity labels, so that if you're rolling out, you may want to provide online guidance in URL in a web format. And that way you can then supply that URL with the policy, so people get additional information on how to use sensitivity labels within the org, or potentially who to contact for more information. So you can apply default labeling. So the next screens open up on the left. You notice the navigation slightly changed because you can go into more details on certain sections. So we can apply default labels to documents, to emails, and also to Power BI content. So something you might want to consider doing with your sensitivity label strategy is saying, hey, I'm going to create a default label. So you might say, I'm going to create a default label, and that label is going to be unclassified or requires classification. Something that's obvious to let a user know that someone has not vetted this content to indicate its actual classification, but more it is not being classified as yet. It's also handy to have a default, because if you do a governance strategy where you're going to enforce it, make it mandatory, if you have a default, then you can review all assets that have the default label and then go down a review and training exercise to understand why haven't a lot of the objects been updated. We name our policy and we enter a description, and then we get the ability to see all those settings summarized and go ahead and create the policy at the end. So now we've got a new policy created. Wait between sort of a few hours and 24 hours for it to publish, so don't be surprised if it's not quite there yet to use straight after you finish these screens. So think about that with your rollout. Don't expect same day, just in case it takes a little bit more time. And then when we go back into the Microsoft Purview portal, we can now see in our labeling list, we'll have a sensitivity label applied, and in our policy list, we'll also see the policy that's related to that. One thing to note here is the order. You can define the order of the policies, so be mindful of that for when later down the track, if you are doing things like you have a series of Excel files that have sensitivity labels and you're bringing those into a Power BI report. If the labeling's different, Power BI can only take the one label, Power BI Desktop. So what one label will that be? The most restrictive one. So be mindful of the granularity you choose on your labels, so that where someone is doing mashup across multiple sensitivity labeled data sets, that the most restrictive one is going to be the one that's taken. And what does that mean in terms of usability? Now we're going to look, now that we've seen that, so we've gone in, we've set up a label, we're licensed, we have set up an initial label, we've published that label for use across the organization. What does it now look as our end user? What do they see and how do they interact with it? How do we then add labels to different tools, and what tools can we use within the data estate? So the first one is Excel, and I've put a note here, store in blob storage. That's for later on. This same file is stored in blob storage for the Purview demos. When I say demos, it's screenshots. It's not live demos, but screenshots of my demo tenant. So the first thing you notice is that inside Excel, there'll be a sensitivity button in the ribbon up the top, far right hand side. With that, it will appear grayed out for two reasons. If you're not signed in, because obviously if you're not signed in, it can't go to Office 365 to get the labels that apply to your account. And secondly, if you don't have sensitivity labels set up. So if you've got no labels in your tenant, then it's not going to display anything. If you are signed in and you do have sensitivity labels that are accessible to the account you're signed in with, the button will be enabled. And then you can go ahead and select the button in order to be able to see the labeling that you can select for a particular file. So here, even though this is a different tenant, you can see I'm signed in as Heidi Hasting, and then I have access to a confidential label. So if we go ahead and apply that label to an Excel file, we would select it from the menu. And once we've done that, it will place the sensitivity label within the status bar down the bottom left. So now if we were to open an Excel file, we would be able to see straight away if the sensitivity label is applied. Bottom left, you will see the information. So if someone gives you a file that's different, you will see the different sensitivity label as long as you have access to the label. Within Word, it's same, it's in the ribbon and you select the sensitivity label, but the thing I wanted to show here is that the watermark does get applied in the instance of Word. So Excel, not so much. Word, yes. Power BI, no. But again, it displays the sensitivity label within the status bar down the bottom. Power BI. So when we talk about Power BI, so now we're really getting into that data estate world, we're talking about desktop and service. And I do want to point out that Power BI Report Server on-prem, the functionality is not currently available for Power BI Report Server on-prem. When it comes to what Power BI types it is available to, you've got dashboards and reports, data marts and data sets, data flows, and also paginated reports, but not workbooks. So when we look at this, paginated reports, you'll notice has the little asterisks. And the reason for that is when you're working with Power BI reports, when you're creating them, if you are creating them in Power BI Report Builder, you will not see options to apply the sensitivity in the Report Builder. But once you publish that paginated report up to the service, you will see it in the service, the ability to apply a sensitivity label for the paginated report. Workbooks, even though they're Excel files that are then published, and we know from earlier that Excel files can have sensitivity labels, once they're applied and uploaded to the service, the sensitivity label is not recognized in the service. It's just simply a dash for all workbooks. So now if we wanted to look at applying a sensitivity label, so we're a report developer or someone who's having a bit of a play around with Power BI Desktop, the same thing as with Excel, you would see the sensitivity button in the ribbon at the top. but it would be disabled or grayed out if you had a tenant with no sensitivity labels or if you're not logged in, because as with Excel, you need to sign in order for it to recognize Office 365 to determine from the Microsoft purview what information protection sensitivity labels you have access to for that account. So also be mindful if you are chopping and changing accounts, if you have multiple accounts for your organization, just check you're using the right account to get the right labels. Once I am signed in, I can see then that the button will be enabled, and I'll see what labels are available to my account, so I can go ahead and use those. So if we look at a Power BI desktop file here, so I've got a brand new report, I'm going to set it to confidential. And as with the other products, so with the Office products, the sensitivity labels displayed in the status bar down the bottom. So if you think about if someone's sending PBIX Power BI report files around, this is how you would see if they've got a sensitivity label applied. You can see it from the ribbon, but straight away you would see it in the status bar. If we then want to publish that Power BI report to service, it's not just a case of publish and it's all good to go. There are actually a couple of tenant level settings that need to be considered. So if you're not in a Power BI administrator role, you want to talk to either your Power BI administrator role users or your global admins to talk about the tenant settings within Power BI service. So the area you want to go to, if you've never seen the admin portal within Power BI service, there's a little gear icon, select that, go to admin portal, and that will open up this menu options. Within that, under tenant settings, under information protection, you'll see the various options when it comes to labeling. The main one is allowing users to apply sensitivity labels for content. So once that's enabled, we can then publish Power BI reports to service that use the labeling. We can also apply labeling directly within the service itself. And one cool thing is if you're thinking about how am I going to roll out Power BI with sensitivity labels, if you don't want to go mandatory or you don't want to go all users for an org, consider running a pilot program. So you might pick a subset of users that are going to pilot the functionality. And the cool thing here is we have that additional granularity option for the tenant setting. So we can go in and either say this setting applies to the entire org, the setting applies to the entire org minus a subset of users. That might be things like service accounts and the like, where you're not expecting them to publish because it would be your users publishing. The other one is going the opposite, which is I want to pilot this with a subset of users. So you can enable it for a specific security group, and then you can still enable, you can still exclude or include other security groups on top of that. So you may want to pilot the functionality with a subset of users. Once you get it all familiar, your training's in a state where it's looking good for a rollout across the wider organization, then you can start adding. Or if you're starting with one area of your org and then extending out to other areas over time, you could do specific security group and add there as you go along with your rollout. The other options you have is applying sensitivity labels from data sources to the respective Power BI reports, and also applying sensitivity labels to downstream content. So when we're looking at downstream content, think about that as, say you've got a Power BI data set that has a sensitivity label applied and someone's creating reporting off that data set. By default, as they create reporting, it will indicate the data set they're using has a sensitivity label, and therefore the report as a downstream content will get that same sensitivity label as its first port of call. And in the case of there being multiple sensitivity labels, i.e. if you're doing data mashups, then within that it will take the most restrictive one. So we've got our tenant settings adjusted so that we can use sensitivity labels. Now what does that mean? So we looked a little bit around Power BI desktop, so more your report creators and content creators. If they then publish that to Power BI service, as an end user, how do I see what labeling's been applied? Can I see that in service? What does it look like? And then that helps influence your governance rollout strategies as well as to what you need to provide in the training and guidance. So in the case of the workspace view, you'll see in list view of a workspace that the sensitivity label appears as a column within that view. So you think about that as a metadata, a piece of metadata about a data asset that you see straight away when you're looking at the list of them. So you might use the sensitivity labeling for, say, federal standards. So in Australia, we have IRAP, so we might label things as public, as confidential, as secret, Or we might look at the labeling in terms of a zone. So we might say this is a bronze zone, this is a silver zone, this is a gold zone, to indicate has the data set and data assets been vetted, or is it sort of free for all? We've not vetted it, use at your own risk. Or is it gold standard, which means you can use it for all commercial reporting? You may consider using sensitivity labels as a different way to whether it's industry standard or something else that's appropriate for your org, because it is a metadata element you have access to. We can also see it in the lineage view. So within lineage view, you can see across the different types whether sensitivity labels are enabled or not. Enabled and applied. So in this case, we can see here that both the data set, the data report, and the dashboard all have sensitivity labels applied. And the label, if you were to select the icon, you see what the label is. So now if you're looking at the workspace in terms of lineage view, you'll be able to quickly see how are we using sensitivity labels and what things are we using them on. And then if you click something, you can see what the label is. So if someone was to say to you, can I share this report with user XYZ? If your sensitivity label, it defines who gets access to what in terms of your business process, then you will be able to use that information to answer that question. When we look at a report directly, if we load up a report, the sensitivity label is displayed next to the title of the report. And if we were to open the additional properties little card, we would see the sensitivity label is also displayed there. So if someone's going into a report, they get a direct link straight in, they'll still see the sensitivity label on the report itself. When we look at data marts, as with the other types, we can see the sensitivity label in the list view. But the other thing to be aware of is a data mart, when you create a new data mart, the menus for creating a data mart don't have the sensitivity label. So if you're wondering how you apply a sensitivity label to a data mart, once it's been created, you then go into the settings, and then within settings, you will see sensitivity labels as one of the options, and the labels in the list will be those that the account that you're viewing the data mart with have access to. So if you do swap accounts, make sure you're using the right account to access the content and apply the sensitivity labels. But also look at it in terms of a data mart under the hood is a series of tables and data columns. But when it comes to sensitivity labels, you can only put it at the data mart level, so it doesn't go to that lower granularity. But one thing I want to point out here is that we've got the fact that this is a preview, data mart's a preview. So you need to be mindful with a lot of the sensitivity label functionality, it is also in preview. So it might be something where your organization chooses not to go use preview functionality. So you want to review what functionality you can and can't use. Or it might be you're evaluating the functionality for its use in line with your governance strategies. And if it's in line with it, then go ahead and use the functionality. If it's not yet in line with it, don't not review in 2, 3, 6, 12 months time, because the products are changing all the time. So always look at the roadmaps to see what's coming up. Always look at the considerations to see what's applicable now. And then if that changes over time, re-review your stance on using the functionality. If we're looking to create a new dashboard, so within the new dashboard, in this case, I've picked a report that already has a sensitivity label. So when I go to create a dashboard by pinning the report, I'll get a little message to say that the report sensitivity label confidential we applied, because that's what's coming from the report. It has confidential, therefore the dashboard will automatically be confidential. But if I was working on, and the other thing to note is once you do load that dashboard, you'll see the dashboard sensitivity label within the title, next to the title, and in the additional tile information if you load the properties of the dashboard. If I did want to change the sensitivity label for a dashboard or apply a sensitivity label once I've turned on all the functionality, the way to do that is within the workspace. You can go into the dashboard settings, and then within settings, scroll about 3/4 of the way down, you'll see the sensitivity label options. And again, that label list is those that your account that's logged in has access to. And then once you've done that for dashboards, another thing you want to look at is paginated reports. Okay, so the next thing we're going to look at is paginated reports, which are often built in the Power BI report builder. With paginated reports, if you load up Power BI report builder and you select Power BI dataset, this is what viewpoint you would see. And you'll notice here that no sensitivity labeling is displayed. So if you are building Power BI reports that are paginated, just make sure your report builders are aware not to check this to see what sensitivity labels have been applied to a data set, but to check Power BI service itself. Once I have selected one of those data sets and created a query, you notice that we don't have it anywhere on the ribbon for the sensitivity label, and there's no properties shown either. So it's important that people are aware sensitivity labels in Power BI Report Builder, you will not see them. Once you've uploaded that paginated report, you've published it to the Power BI service, you'll see that the sensitivity label column is dash, but in the case of a paginated report, you can go into the settings of that report, and then in the settings, pick the sensitivity label to apply to the report itself. Next one's data flows. So data flows are like a couple of the others where you create the data flow. Once the data flow has been created, so you'll see here a new data flow, then you can go in and apply the sensitivity label using the settings. So if we click the settings menu for a data flow, and then within that, the sensitivity label options are displayed, so we can apply a sensitivity label to our data flows as well. One of the things I mentioned early on is around that security caveat. So sensitivity labels do not implicitly imply security, but in the areas where they do apply is something like Excel. So if a user tries to access a report in Power BI, if they have access to that workspace, they can access the report regardless of the sensitivity label that's been applied. But if they try to export to Excel and they're using an account that does not have access to that sensitivity label, then Excel will warn them that they're not signed in with an appropriate permissioned account. If you are just switching user accounts, switch accounts, and you'll then be able to access the data. If the data someone is trying to export it who doesn't have access, then they will not be able to see the data. So there are some security elements that apply when it comes to Office and third party. The other thing to be aware of is with an Excel file, as we talked about, Excel files can have sensitivity labels applied, but when you publish them to service, they're considered a workbook and there is no sensitivity label appearing there. When we look at downstream content, so in this case, we've got a data set that has the confidential sensitivity label applied. If we go ahead and create a new report off that data set, we're automatically informed that the data set has a sensitivity label, and therefore the new report will get the same sensitivity label to start with. And once we do save that report, it's the same as earlier. So you see the sensitivity label next to the title of the report. If we're using Excel to analyze our Power BI data sets, because Excel does recognize sensitivity labels, within Excel, if you get data and go Power BI data set, you will see the sensitivity label information appear within the card about the data set. So it's pretty cool that when you're analyzing Excel, it still shows the sensitivity labels the same way. If you're creating a new report, it takes the downstream content. Once I've selected that data set, we're informed that there has been a sensitivity label applied. So you get those tips that you would see, and then the status bar down the bottom shows what label is applied for that data set and therefore now what's applied to this Excel file. A couple of gotchas to be aware of. The workspace access is what defines who's got access to different reports, not the sensitivity labels. Exporting to Excel is where that security can kick in and block access to the data. If you're looking at sensitivity labels being inherited and you're using multiple data sets and mashing them up, be mindful that the most restrictive one will be applied. And because it is an Office 365 setting, be mindful also if you're doing B2B or multi-tenant scenarios that it's not sensitivity labels are not supported. Another gotcha that I noticed when I was doing some of these demo screenshots is I created a sensitivity label. Power BI Desktop recognized that that label was available and I put it on there. When I published it to service did not recognize the label. It came up with a little warning. Simply go into the actual settings and apply the label there if you do get that scenario. I found that just resolved it. Another thing to point out is always look at the considerations and limitations that Microsoft have on the Microsoft Docs for the various functionality. They do publish it for sensitivity labels and they go into quite a lot of detail around the different scenarios that it works for and doesn't work for. And the other thing is check back because it's an ever-evolving bit of functionality. So check back on what the limitations are at the time you evaluate, as well as at the times you're going to re-evaluate to determine if it's appropriate for your business use case. Next, we're going to look at Azure SQL. Azure SQL does also have the ability to have sensitivity labels. They deem it under the classification functionality. So within the Azure portal, if you're looking at an Azure SQL resource, and then inside the security data discovery and classification space, you'll notice that you can select a classification and add a classification. And when you are adding, you get the ability to add it at the column level within an Azure SQL resource. So I can select the scheme of the table and the column and then what label has been applied. But a really important thing to note is that sensitivity list of labels is not the same as Office 365. So they are not synced and integrated. So if you are working in Azure SQL, the list you see in the sensitivity label list is managed directly within Azure. One cool feature that Azure SQL does have is the ability to see an overarching view of what sensitivity labels have been applied within our Azure SQL resource, and then specifically the details on those. So we can see that 2 labels have been applied across 2 columns, well, same label, but across 2 columns, therefore 2. And so we can see what columns those are, and make a mental note of this because you'll see in Purview that that sensitivity label is, you would think it's confidential, it's not. So it's confidential here, but in Purview, it'll be blank. We can also look at it from a T-SQL viewpoint. So if you're thinking about doing any auditing or monitoring, you can query the information about sensitivity labels in your database using T-SQL. And that's kind of handy because you may want to consider using that in conjunction with the Azure SQL security to restrict access to certain things. If I wanted to add additional sensitivity labels or make adjustments to the labeling that's there, within the portal, once you are in the SQL resource, you can select security, data discovery, and classification, and then you can go in and configure here and add and adjust the labels that are available within your Azure SQL. So you may want to adjust them to fit how you're going to do your data classifications within Azure SQL resources. They may be different or the same as what you do in Office 365 and Power BI. Purview is the next one I wanted to show you. Purview being that overarching data governance metadata management product within the Microsoft stack. We have the option of viewing sensitivity labels across our data estate, and we also have the option of automatically applying sensitivity labels across our data estate. I'm not going to go into the latter one, but I will provide you some links at the end for more details. Within Azure Purview, this screenshot is taken from a tenant where I have spun up an Azure Purview. I've gone and scanned my Power BI tenant that you saw the Power BI screenshots from, minus data sets, minus data flows, data marts, because those were created after I did the scan. Then we've got the Azure SQL, and I've also scanned blob storage where I put a copy of the Excel file into, so you can see what Purview recognizes for sensitivity labels across those 3. So you notice when you're in Purview, so I'm going to go straight into Data Catalog and browse assets. And within the assets list, I can see the sensitivity labels here as a filter. So I can filter to a label. This is the sensitivity labels. This is the Office 365 sensitivity labels. So where I'm picking confidential here, you'll notice that Azure SQL does not appear in this list because it's not recognizing the Azure SQL sensitivity label. It's recognizing the Office 365 one. Once I have picked a label, I can then see next to the asset name what label's been applied in a cool little, rounded box display. So I can see that all these Power BI types have confidential sensitivity label. If I have more labels, they would display different labels. Within a Power BI report, so if we're navigating straight into an asset, we can see the label that's appropriate to that asset next to the title itself. So not in properties or overview, but next to the title here. So if you think about how you're going to communicate to people like your data stewards, data custodians, data analysts, anyone looking at Purview to understand what data do we have available to the organization, what is the classification around that data asset, this is how they would recognize that. So if someone's saying, hey, I've identified a data set that's appropriate for a business request that's come in. Is it a classified data set that can be used or distributed to that particular requester? Where would I see the sensitivity label? This is where they would see it. So if it does have confidential, straight away a user knows if they go to use that Power BI report for something, it's considered a sensitivity label of confidential, therefore treat appropriately to the org. So if we continue on now, what does it look like for the other types? Very much the same. So if we looked at a report before, now looking at a data set, it will display the sensitivity label to the right of the title. And then if we look at Excel, this is one of those not applicable in Purview. So the bottom screenshot shows our Power BI workspace with our Excel file uploaded, and you can see it doesn't display the sensitivity label there. In the Purview scan, it doesn't even display that we have a workbook available to us. So workbook here, not in Purview, therefore you won't see the sensitivity label in Purview either for that workbook. The Azure SQL resource, we saw earlier, if you remember that mental note we made, the sensitivity label we had was for the phone had confidential and so did the email address. But you'll notice here that the sensitivity label column within Purview shows blank. That's because it's not an Office 365 label. So the sensitivity labels here can be populated for Azure SQL resources using the Purview auto labeling functionality. So using the auto labeling around the classifications and the rules for those, you can automatically apply a label on the back of that, and then this would have a value. But if you're expecting it to have the same value as what you've seen in the Azure SQL resource, it doesn't. The next one's Azure Blob. So I've uploaded the Excel file to Azure Blob storage, and we saw earlier that that Excel file has a sensitivity label applied of confidential, but you will notice here that no sensitivity label is displayed. So what I found was interesting functionality is that I had a file with no data and it had a sensitivity label applied. I loaded that to Blob storage. I scanned the storage. No sensitivity label appeared. I thought it might have been a glitch. Redid the scan, still didn't appear. I then went into the file and added a little bit of data and rescanned the blob storage. And then you'll notice here that a file with data, so I've copied the exact same file and just added some data, it now shows the sensitivity label. So it's not a likely scenario you'd see within an org to have empty files. But if you think about potential template files that you might have for input data sets or extracts or sort of some data discovery pieces, you might have a template file with no data in and therefore but the label applied ready to go. Be mindful of that is not going to just necessarily display in Purview as you would assume. Purview gives us extra options around looking at reporting and monitoring. So if you think about Purview scanning our entire data estate, so now I can see my sensitivity labels across my Azure SQL, across my Power BI, and across my Excel workbooks stored in blob storage, as well as a number of other things if we were to scan them. How do I see, is my labeling being used, or are all those assets using the default label, the unclassified label that we might have put in our strategy? So Purview gives us that option to go into the insights view and then within that the sensitivity label, so we can get an overarching dashboard of what's happening in that sensitivity label space across all our data assets. So you may want to look at leveraging this when you're doing auditing and monitoring, when you're doing training to see is the training effective in the use of sensitivity labels, or when you're making changes to your sensitivity label strategy. So you might go, look, confidential is a really broad sensitivity label. We're going to separate that out into commercial confidential or confidential workforce or confidential HR. And then we're going to put those labels in and see, does that change the way the labeling is used throughout the data estate, throughout the organization? This is a screenshot not from my demo tenant, it's actually from the Microsoft Docs because mine was empty at the time of taking a screenshot. When we look into additional resources, because we didn't cover things like the Azure SQL in depth and also the Azure Purview auto labeling, you can go in here. So I've provided some links around the requirements for licensing that you may need to consider, and again look at it in terms of Office 365, but then also specifically data products you're using, making sure those also have the appropriate licensing to leverage the functionality within 365 and across your entire data estate. Looking at Azure SQL, because those labels are not the same as the Office 365 ones, you could make them the same list because you can adjust the list to what you'd like, but being mindful of that and the internal views that you have access to see additional details from a T-SQL standpoint, and then looking at Azure Purview auto labeling. So where you did want to use the classification applied to the data to then apply sensitivity labels automatically. That might help you if you're trying to roll out en masse Oh, and one thing I didn't mention is with Power BI, you can also use the APIs to attach labels to your Power BI types. So if you decided tomorrow that you're going to roll out for the finance workspace as a particular sensitivity label, then you can use the APIs to apply those labels as opposed to having someone going into each item and changing the sensitivity label. So to recap what we covered today, we looked at the maintenance and management, and I've put Office 365 compliance here. It's now labeled as Microsoft Purview. Previously, it was Office 365 compliance. And then within that, we've looked at how the labels appear across the various products. So what they look like in Power BI, both in the tooling to create reports such as Power BI Desktop, but then also within the service where you can identify the sensitivity labels. We looked at Office, so Word and Excel. We also looked at Azure SQL and then Azure Purview. Now, I didn't go into all the different Azure SQLs, your managed instance, your Elastic Pool databases. I went into a basic PAS one, but have a look at the others, and then Azure Purview for your overarching metadata management and data and information management. We looked at a couple of gotchas. No doubt there'll be more, and there might be more specifically to your use cases and environments that I haven't covered here today. So be mindful of that. You might want to do some test runs for your usage scenarios to see how that works within the product, within the functionality and feature set. And as I said, this is a high level view. So if you did want to look at more details, go into those resource links, check out the Microsoft Docs to see what's happening in this space because it's ever evolving. Huge thank you to Microsoft. Without them, we couldn't have these sorts of events, having our sponsors and supporters. It's been really awesome to have them on board for another year. I want to really thank SQL Server Geeks, Data Platform Geeks. They put on this event. I've been fortunate enough to attend it in person in India and then virtual in years following that. And I think it's an awesome conference. Any conference is great where you get to connect and learn with other data professionals and expand your growth in the industry. It's also really important for you guys to get thanked for the attendees to get thanked for attending these events because you're taking the time out of your day to connect and share and learn. So thank you so much. Once again, I am not presenting this live, but I am in the chat. So if you have questions, drop them in there. I'm more than happy to try and answer them. And what I don't know, potentially it's a good idea for another session. So thanks again. Don't forget you can win prizes. If you're comfortable with posting a selfie, post a selfie, use the hashtag DPS 2022 and see if you can't win one of the prizes that they've got on offer. And do give session feedback as well as conference feedback. It's important, myself as a volunteer and someone who helps organise events, it's really important to get that feedback so we can understand what works and what doesn't work. And everyone's perspective is different. So you may think that someone's already supplied that feedback, but potentially they haven't. So please do jump online, supply us some feedback around my session. I'd love to know what you liked, what you didn't like, whether you like the structure, the flow, if you like the fonts or you didn't like the fonts, or you thought the abstract might cover something else. I'd love to hear that feedback, good, bad, or otherwise. I really want to know because it helps me develop the session. Or if you're thinking, hey, I'd like to do a panel or have an additional session on this covering auto labeling, please feel free to reach out to me through my Twitter account or through my blog, and I'd be more than happy to consider doing follow-up sessions or answer your questions. Check out the hashtag on Twitter. Also check out the Data Geeks and Data AI Summit. And once again, thank you. I've just posted the various photos of me. So if you do get the chance to meet me in person and vice versa, if you can't find me, it's probably I've changed my hair colour, as does happen from time to time. So please, once again, reach out to me on Twitter at Heidi Hasting or drop me a message on my blog. And if there's stuff you want to know, please feel free to ask. I'm no stranger to questions. So thanks again, and I hope you have a really awesome summit. And thanks for joining my session. Bye.